There's one right up front here too.
I'm Deborah Polsky. I'm the Executive Director of the Dallas Jewish Historical Society. And I want to welcome you to the first in a series of 3 programs that we are engaged in with Dallas Jewish Funerals as our partner. The Dallas Jewish Historical Society has been around since 1971, and we collect and protect the memories and the artifacts and the papers of the history of Jewish Dallas, whether you've been here 3 generations or 3 years. We want and keep your stories so that other people can see them. So we encourage you to check out our website, djhs.org. We have a couple of programs coming up in February. The next event is a joint program between the JCC Book Fest and the Historical Society and Temple Emmanuel Sisterhood. And that is the author Pamela Nadell, whose book, America's Jewish Women, was just named Book of the Year by the Jewish Book Council. So she's definitely, the book is fascinating, and I think she'll be great. And that will be at Temple Emmanuel, and we send stuff out about it all the time. The next in our series will be in February on the 16th with Rabbi Walk on traditional Jewish burial customs. And so, without further ado, let me introduce you to our program and our panel up here. The topic of our evening tonight is what happens after we die. So one rabbi compared life and death to a mobile data rollover plan. Okay, everybody knows about mobile data, and you roll over for the next month. Phone's company gives you 5 gigabytes of data per month, and anything that you don't use 1 month rolls over to the next one, right? So if you only use 4 gigabytes in November, the remaining 1 gigabyte is applied to your December allowance, giving you 6 gigabytes for that month. Your soul has multiple gigabytes of spiritual energy and divine potential. This is the power God has invested in you to fulfill your mission in life. You use that potential by doing mitzvahs. And every mitzvah activates another gigabyte of your soul energy. You've been given an allotted number of days in this world to utilize your gigabytes. At the end of the billing cycle, when your time comes due and you leave this life, the activated parts of your soul go to a higher place because that part of you has completed its mission on earth, according to this rabbi. But if you have unused soul potential, if you didn't activate all of the energy invested in you, then that unused part of your soul comes back again in another body, he says, to finish the job. So when someone passes away, we pray that their soul finds rest in heaven, because that's where the already used part of the soul is found. As for the unused part of the soul, it may come back down for another go-round. Our panel tonight is
I just want to say, it's only AT&T and T-Mobile have the rollover plan. So what happens if you sign up for Verizon?
Then when your time runs out, it just runs out.
That was not an endorsement or an advertisement.
Good point. Rabbi Adam Roffman, who you just heard from, is a proud Schechter alum, a graduate of Amherst College with a degree in political science, and Circle in the Square Theater School with a certificate in musical theater performance. He began his rabbinic education at the conservative yeshiva in Jerusalem. Before coming to Congregation Shereth Israel in Dallas, Rabbi Roffman served as the rabbinic fellow at B'nai Yeshurun in Manhattan, where in addition to his pulpit responsibilities, He was a teen educator, oversaw the conversion process for adults and children, and taught a year-long Introduction to Judaism class. Rabbi Roffman graduated with a master's in Talmud from the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he was awarded the Rabbi Max Gelb Memorial Prize in Talmud and the Israel H. Leventhal Prize in Homiletics. Married to Rabbi Shira Wallet? Yeah, also at Cherith, Israel. Rabbi Roffman and his wife are enjoying parenthood with daughters Hannah and Rebecca and look forward to introducing the girls to the joys of dog parks, theaters, concert halls, and baseball stadiums.
Thank you for reading mine first so that I don't look just like terribly unaccomplished next to this man sitting next to me.
He actually gave us very little.
You said short.
I did say short. And we added a few things.
Okay.
Don Allen Croll is the Cantor Emeritus of Temple Shalom and the current spiritual leader of Beth El Binah, the LGBTQ congregation in Dallas, where he has served since 2017.
Yeah.
He served congregations from Nyack, New York to Los Angeles, California. He was the cantor of the LGBTQ congregation Beth Chaim Chashadim Chadashim for 6 years, where he met his husband, Jan Bartenberg. They moved to Dallas in 1996 when Cantor Croll began a 17-year position with
This is
Temple
very
Shalom.
scary. I didn't write any of this.
Well, you know, you go on the internet, you find all
The Jewish search engine is called Google.
this. He is also the Jewish chaplain for Pathways Hospice and a teacher in the Melton program at the JCC. He has appeared as a soloist with the Kol Echad Chorale of Los Angeles, the New Mexico Symphony, and the Turtle Creek Chorale here in Dallas. He also serves as a judge for the Dallas Summer Musicals High School Musicals Award. He is a member of the Cantors Assembly and served on the board of the American Conference of Cantors. And last but not least, our model.
Wait a minute, that's it? You're not going to say where I graduated from? That I
Oh, did I leave that part out?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. He graduated from the Debbie Friedman School of Music?
Sacred music.
Sacred Music at HUC. And what a wonderful place to have graduated from. She was quite the woman. Last but not least,
And I have an honorary doctorate
okay.
for having made it through 25 years.
Ah, yes.
And I got a gold star for making it through 7.
Could you have started with me first?
I know. All right. Dallas Jewish Funerals has been serving the Jewish community here since 2001, and now a Dot Hopping Ring member, Zane Bellier, is one of its new owners. Zane, his wife Jill, and their 2 sons Dylan and Zachary have been members of Adat for 3 years.
And Anshe.
And
I
Anshe.
kind of go back and forth.
Okay. Yeah, it's like where I grew up. Everybody belonged to at least 2 sons. From an early age, Zane wanted to help people in need. He attended Southern Illinois University, studying social work and psychology, and worked post-graduation with abused and neglected children. Then spent 11 years in the education industry, eventually becoming vice president of recruitment for a large education firm. In 2011, after many years of business travel and with a young growing family in Dallas, he decided to settle down and follow the advice of one of his mentors and began a new career in the funeral industry. At the end of 2017, he joined the Dallas Jewish Funerals family. True to his roots in social work, Zane finds it deeply rewarding to help families during one of the worst and most stressful moments of their lives. He's instilled that passion for service throughout the company. Every member of our team at Dallas Jewish Funerals has a solemn commitment to serve all of our families at well beyond their expectations. We absolutely won't let them down. Zane and Dallas Jewish Funerals are the corporate sponsor for our 2019 Dallas Jewish Historical Society and Socorro Humanitarian Award event. And additionally, they donate a percentage of their net profits to Jewish Family Service as part of their commitment to the community. And Zane will act as our moderator tonight. So I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. I was scared when she said about internet, what you find. So I'm glad that she's, So we have a list of questions that a number of individuals, I believe, from the Dallas Historical Society put together. And I believe we are going to open up to Q&A at the end. So if any of your questions aren't asked in this initial series of questions, and certainly speak up. We have a microphone, so in case you can't hear me, raise your hand and I'll speak in the microphone. As you ask questions, I'll stay standing so I can run around the room and bring the microphone to you. As I ask each question, we'll get a perspective from both of our clergy that are joining us today. So we have two different perspectives based on these questions. Because what's the joke we talked earlier? You can get two rabbis in the room and have four different opinions, right? So we want to make sure that we open this up and are as well-rounded as possible. So with that, I'll start with the questions. The first question: what do our denominations say about what happens after you die? So, Cantor, would you like to?
Well, we were talking before that there are levels of belief that go back to biblical times, and beliefs keep changing. Where you go keeps changing. How you get there keeps changing. Perhaps you've heard of a place called Sheol, which the Greeks translated into Hades, which means the netherworld, and it wasn't up there, it was down there. And so, correct me if I'm wrong, souls, everybody goes there, and people, the righteous people, if you will, make their way up to the place that they're supposed to go. Not so righteous people, it takes a little longer, and the very wicked never get to go any place. And so there is a Jewish hell, if you will, but it's not really hell. Then there's another place called Gehenna, which is also they thought was hell because that was, they think, where garbage was tossed in ancient times over the wall in Jerusalem. And they said that there was a constant fire going, and that's why they got the idea that hell is a fire burning and you're tortured. I do have to say that there are all different kinds of ideas as to where we go when we pass away. Reform Jews, when it comes to believing in where we go, they're agnostic. They're not quite sure where they're going to go, if there is a heaven or a hell.
Thank you. Rabbi Roffman.
So I would certainly affirm everything that Don said. I think one of the other ways to look at this from the most traditional point of view is that the afterlife really can be split into two components. One is the immortality of the soul, which is to say, like, our spirit, which lives forever, and some will say even what existed before our body had life in it. And the other is the resurrection of the body. The idea that at some point in the future, it's usually associated with some sort of messianic era, somehow the dead will rise from the grave. And actually there is rabbinic legend about how those who live in the diaspora will roll through these underground tunnels and make their way to Jerusalem, because so many of these messianic ideas are tied up with the ingathering of the exiles for living in the land of Israel. that Jerusalem is the place where this is all going to go down, and that's why, by the way, there's a very big cemetery right next to the old city in Jerusalem, and you pay a lot of money to be buried there, because that's where the resurrection of the body will start. So both of those ideas, I would say, are responded to in various different ways by the different movements of Judaism.
And the proof text of all this, some of it that we will come back is from.
Can the panelists use the microphone?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
So you know the story. You know the story of Ezekiel, and the dry bones. So the rabbis use that as a good proof text to say, look, it says through Ezekiel that we in fact are going to come back. And you know, traditional Jews, if they have an amputation, they want that part of their body put into a grave so that when they are resurrected, it's there waiting for them and they will come back whole.
Yeah, and I should say that what you believe about this probably ties into what you believe about how Judaism works as a whole, which is to say that if you're Orthodox, you believe that the Torah, the two parts of the Torah, the part that was written down in the books that we have, the Bible, and principally the 5 books of Moses, and how the rabbis interpreted that Bible, all came from one place, which was it was all given to God on Mount Sinai. The reason that that's important is because the idea of either the immortality of the soul or the resurrection of the body is completely absent from biblical text, with only a few exceptions. It was the rabbi's interpretation of those words in the Torah, and we can talk about how that came to be, that got us to a place where we have these two concepts, the resurrection of the body and the immortality of the soul. And if you believe that those two parts of the Torah are inseparable from each other, and both should be given equal weight in terms of their divine origin, then you believe these, all of the things that we're telling you. If you are a conservative Jew, most of us sort of buy into this historical evolution of these ideas that Cantor Croll mentioned before, and that is why you may sort of question whether these ideas, since they were originally not part of the oldest text that we have, and are later, sometimes that changes your point of view as to how accurate those views are, or whether or not these were human beings creating some of these ideas, either out of some sort of divine connection or for their own emotional, spiritual needs. A lot of what we believe about the afterlife has to do with our experience of life itself. And out of those experiences in life, we can sort of project forward about what it is that we would like to imagine or what we might believe about the future after we die.
And is there an afterlife? Well, we know from 2 Samuel, I think, when King Saul was despondent, he didn't know what to do when he was at war, and so he went to a witch. And Endor? Is that
Yes, the Witch of Endor.
The Witch of Endor. He went to her and he said, is there any way you can bring Samuel to me? Samuel was dead. And she did. And he spoke to Samuel. And Samuel, in essence, said, what are you bothering me for? So, and that's what it says in Deuteronomy, that do not go to witches or sorcerers. When we say may they rest in peace, we really mean may the souls rest in peace. And I have a story, by the way, of bringing back the dead. So my mother and I were visiting my father's grave in where else, Florida, and it was at Forest Lawn in Pompano Beach, and we're walking in. We walked in the front entrance, and she's looking around at all of these graves, and she said, where are all these people going to go when we come back? And then she had a great rabbinic answer. Who am I to know what God has planned? But she was a believer. She was an Orthodox Jew, and she believed that we were coming back.
Thank you. And I do think some of these questions will spill over as we talk. So I may repeat some of what you said, and if you want to ad lib or add on to it, then feel free, or we can move on to the next question. The next one is, do we believe in heaven and hell? Which I think a lot was addressed. Rabbi Roffman, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, so I know that Cantor Croll used the word hell. I think the Jews are allergic to these words, heaven and hell, and I'll tell you why, right? Primarily because they are Christian ideas. It was Christianity that really sort of reads the story of Genesis, of the creation of the world, of the creation of man, and sees the snake, right, that tricks Eve into eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and then giving it to her husband, as a manifestation of Satan, of the devil. And the devil, therefore, if the devil exists, the devil must have his domain where he collects these sinners. And I mean, heaven, right, is the reward for the righteous. So, of course, right, we're Jews, not Christian, and we want to differentiate ourselves from Christians by, number one, not using their words, but also really altering the frame at which we look at these ideas. We don't believe that we were born into sin. We don't believe that we were created through this kind of encounter with evil. But rather that we are born with the potential, we have this sort of clean slate, that we earn the credits that we talked about before, and that our God is a loving, merciful, forgiving God. That even the sinners who are stuck in limbo in Sheol have an opportunity to repent, or even some believe even through reincarnation, they can re-enter the world and try again, so that eventually they'll earn their place with God. Where that place is with God, I mean, you could use the word heaven, and I think Jews use it a lot, but I think we're very reluctant to use the word hell because of what it implies, which is eternal damnation, forever and ever and ever. And that's just not an idea that we associate with how it is that we want to conceive an eternal future for our folks, right? I think we have a little bit more, maybe a little bit more optimism.
All right. Thank you. Why do we have confession before we pass away?
So there are a lot of things that you do as a rabbi that when you know that you're about to do something, you kind of have to stop and take a moment and say, okay, is what I'm about to do going to freak out the person that I'm about to do it with? And one of those things near the top of the list is this vidui, this confession that we do before death. And frequently when I go into the room of a hospital room of somebody who is about to pass, and I suggest this idea to them that we're going to do this, I hope we'll get a chance to do this ritual together, they get very uncomfortable very quickly. And I have to do a really good job of hoping them, again, sort of, it's interesting, see how many times Christianity comes back into the conversation. I have to distinguish between what Christians do when they enter into the confessional booth in church with what it is that we are about to do together in that moment. Judaism loves liminality. It loves these spaces in between one thing and another. And the transition from life to death is but one of many liminal moments. In moments of transition, one of the things that we think about is how can we move from this stage to the next with really no weight holding us back? How can we purify ourselves, clean ourselves, rid ourselves of the crap that we carry around sort of emotionally, spiritually, so that we can enter into that next stage of whatever it is with our conscience clear. That's why brides and grooms, before they get married, they do vidui. They do this thing, like very similar to what we do in Yom Kippur, where we beat our breast and we say, I did this and we did this and we did that. So that's essentially what this ritual is. It is perhaps the last in life. It is the last in life, that in a series of liminal moments in which we give ourselves the opportunity to rid ourselves of these things that we did wish that we hadn't done, or the emotional grudges that we may be carrying with us. And it's very different than, oh, I need to confess my sins so that I don't go to hell, right? Or I need to confess my sins because we're all sinners.
but rather I sort of present it as an opportunity for passing from one place to another in peace.
So, and it's nothing like last rites that you hear.
Right, that's
that
right.
Christians go through, there we go, that Christians go through. I recently was with a gentleman who was already unconscious, and it's okay for me to recite it with the family around him. And everyone knows what's the last thing that's supposed to be on your lips before you pass away? Shema. Whenever there's turbulence in an airplane, I'm saying the Shema. And so if the person who is going on their journey, if you will, can't say it, then it's okay if a rabbi or a cantor or you can say it. It doesn't need, you ask us to do these things because we happen to have the book with the words. But you could borrow the book. And as you said, the person who is passing, which is a great word, if they can recite it with you, that's the best.
Yeah.
Or by themselves.
The Torah makes reference to a place called Sheol. You mentioned that a little while ago. As well as Gehenna, Gan Eden, and Olam Haba. What do these terms signify about what happens after our physical deaths?
Well, obviously it signifies that there's a destination. That our beings, if you will, are going someplace, which gives us great solace. It means that when we pass away, we're going someplace else. And depending on your interpretation of those terms, like Gan Eden is the Garden of Eden, which is paradise, which some people equate with heaven, if you will. We're going to paradise, like the Garden of Eden. And I should state in the memorial prayer, in the Reform movement, in the conservative movement, you talk about going to Gan Eden. Reform Jews have excised that. It's not in El Malei Rachamim, because of the beliefs that we're not going any place that we know, whether it be the Garden of Eden or Sheol or Gehenna or the Olam Haba, the world to come, that it's really what the person, my feelings are, we're going to go wherever we think we're going to go. If I'm going to go to Gan Eden, if you believe that, then that's where you're going to go. If I believe that I have too many sins on my hands, then I'm going to go to Sheol for a while, but only for a while.
It's like a work camp.
So yeah, we talked about Gehenna and Sheol. I'll just say that this trying to conceive of the space that we go to, I agree. I mean, I think most conservative Jews as well are very ambivalent about these terms. But I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge about them is that that they exist because for many, many generations in this life, we suffered a lot. That as Jews in exile, being kicked from one corner of the earth to another, we examined our own behavior, and we looked at the Torah. And the Torah says, look, if you misbehave, I'm going to, I use this word with my confirmation students, my high school students. If you misbehave, God's going to zap you, right? What do we do to deserve this? Nothing. This is being visited upon us for something that is not our fault. And that, by the way, God told us to do. You told us that we were Jewish. You told us that we needed to act this way. And so this just doesn't add up. So there must be some other existence, God. There must be. Because if this is all that there is, this ain't fair. It's just not right. And if you believe that God is loving and kind and just and merciful, and you want to hold on to that belief, then you also, I think, are going to want to believe in this Gan Eden, in this Olam Haba, in this idea that it will be paid forward to you at some future time in some future place which we can't define, or we might choose not to define, or we might choose to define very specifically depending on what your orientation is. But I think that's how that's the origin of a lot of those ideas. As I said, how we think about where we go after we die, I think, has a lot to do with our experience of life now. And I think it's interesting that for a while, this idea of the afterlife was kind of not kosher. Right? I think for a lot of us, we didn't want to think about this. There's a lot of renewed interest in that now, and I think that has to do with the fact that this word spirituality has entered into our work in a really serious way, which is to say, what this thing that we're trying to activate, it's called the spirit. We should be activating the spirit when we pray. We shouldn't settle for experiences that don't activate the spirit. And therefore, the spirit must be something different than the body. And since it's not corporeal, since it doesn't have a container, it must go somewhere. Last thing I want to say, I don't know whether this story is going to fit in someplace else, but it's a really important story for me, so I'll just share it now. For many, many years, I was terrified of death. My grandmother died when I was 6 years old, and this came out of the blue, and I was just shocked. Really, I went to the funeral. I looked at the casket, and she can't possibly be in there. I mean, not this woman that a few weeks ago was, holding me on her lap and kissing me and hugging me and loving me. It can't be. And I just didn't get it until I was in rabbinical school, and I was asked to participate in a tahara. A tahara is a ritual cleaning of the body in preparation for burial, and I was mortified. I was like, oh my God, this is going to be awful. And I walked in the room, and we began to prepare the body, and something just hit me right away. There's nobody home. This is a body, but it is an empty vessel. Whatever it was that what is animating this person is just no longer inside that body. But I just refuse to believe that it's just gone. I see the remains of the body, but I don't see the remains of the soul, and that's because I just don't believe that the remains of the soul die. I came to believe in that moment that what had animated that person went someplace else, right?
The idea that when we talk about at Yom Kippur, your sins are weighed, and God will decide in Unatana Tokef who will live and who will die. That if how come it works for you? And but.
It's because your electric personality is just...
Right, it's shocking.
Those young people, technology is always working for them.
Right, as older people, it doesn't work. Is this a computer? So there is the hope that because what you have done in this world, you will be somehow, what's the word I'm looking for? Honored, rewarded. And also, on the other hand, the people who aren't so nice to you or others, they will also get, as we say, their just reward. And we're hoping that there will be some kind of retribution for them as well.
And it's working again.
But right here it doesn't work.
Rambam and Ramban disagree on what happens after we die. They agree that the soul comes from a heavenly tribunal and is judged and then assigned a place in the world to come. Rambam says there is a spiritual reward after you die, bathing in the light of the divine. Ramban says that Olam Haba refers to the world after the Messiah comes, when we all come back to life. Who would like to take this on?
What's the question?
What do you think about that?
What do you think about that? What is your opinion on that?
So what you have here is a classic conflict between two schools of Jewish thought, the intellectuals and the mystics. Maimonides was a rational man. He believed that essentially the Torah was Plato kind of put inside this Jewish kind of container. And that if you couldn't figure out something with your mind, that meant that it wasn't true. And that if you disagreed with him, it was because you were an idiot and your mind didn't work well. Ramban was a spiritual man, which is to say that he was, here I'm using spirit in terms of the way in which we sort of, the Kabbalah, the mystical tradition, influences how it is that we live and how it is that we interpret the text. So if anytime you have a disagreement between the Ramban, between Maimonides, and the Ramban, Nachmanides, you have to think about where it is that they're getting their ideas and where the place that they consider those ideas sort of best to be. Because Rambam is an intellectual and he is a sort of follows that Platonic school, for him the spirit is primary. So the body is just a vessel. It's just the carrier in this life, but it's not primary. It's the thing that that has appetites and desires that need to be reined in and controlled. That eventually the body dies, and when the body dies, it's really not important anymore. What's important is that the soul live on in some way. Nachmanides, in a spiritual way, in his own spiritual way, sort of paradoxically, though he was spiritual, he believed part of the spiritual was the enjoyment of the body. So how do we experience spirituality? We eat, we have sex, we have these sort of really sublime experiences in which the spirit sort of elevates the body. And for him, he couldn't imagine an afterlife where the body wasn't a participant in that sort of future. I'm trying to sort of tease out these differences here. Again, a lot of why it is that these rabbis believed different things really had to do with their particular school of thought.
I agree.
What does our tradition say about reincarnation?
I think was it Maimonides who believed in reincarnation?
Reincarnation is really, again, a kind of a mystical spiritual idea based on so if you believe it, as the mystics do, in the idea that God at one point occupied everything, and that in creating the world, God contracted into God's self, right, and became small, and was left over where was everything else, and also these divine sparks. And it was sort of activating these divine sparks through mitzvot, through following the commandments, that God reemerges into the world, so that one day in the Messianic era, everything will be restored. What's also really important in this mystic tradition is this idea of Shvirat HaKelim, of the broken vessels. When we talk about Tikkun Olam, when we talk about repairing the world, what we're talking about is the brokenness of the world that we inherited when God withdrew from it. It's our responsibility to repair through these religious, spiritual actions. The mystics believed that we got more than one shot at this. That the soul in life, right, collects certain sparks, and then the body dies, and then the soul goes into somebody else's body to collect more sparks. So that by the time the Messiah comes and God sort of re-enters the world in a total way, these souls that existed with God at the beginning of creation will have done all of the work of restoring the brokenness of the world and collecting the sparks to bring God back in, to pave the way for this kind of messianic era. The other thing about reincarnation is that some believe, going back to the question of suffering, why do the righteous suffer? Well, because in the previous life they sinned. In the previous life, they sinned. And now that their body, now that the soul has passed on to a new body, the suffering that that person is being visited with is a result of the mistake that they made in their past life, which I could find to be a terrible idea. And the other thing that I just want to say about reincarnation is that if you ask most Jews, I think, especially conservative Reformed Jews, and you say, do Jews believe in reincarnation, what will they say? No. And I think the vast majority of Jews to the left of Orthodoxy, and even within Orthodoxy itself, I think, my guess is that there will only be certain areas where you'll find people who are really bought into this idea of reincarnation, which again, I think also, we could talk more about Christianity, right? But I think that's another one of those things that sort of rings bells for us that seems like, oh, this isn't us, it's somebody else.
Now,
What is that?
I have a question for you. Would you say that there are only a certain number of souls that exist?
Yes.
And so they keep coming back. Some of them keep coming back.
Yes. Right. I mean,
According to this view, if the souls were there with God at the beginning, that's because there were a finite number of them, right? And they keep recycling and recycling and recycling. And perhaps there are some souls. If you're going to ask the question, well, Rabbi, it used to be that there were 2 people in the world and there are 8 billion people in the world. What happened to all those? What were all those souls doing at the very beginning? I would say, well, God knew at one point how many souls there would be necessary for some point in the future, and that's how many souls there were at the beginning. But I think, if reincarnation exists, if souls keep recycling, then I think there can only be a finite number of them.
And that's the Nachmanides?
I don't know that that's specific. I don't know. I can't say for sure whether Nachmanides himself believed in reincarnation, but Nachmanides was a mystic, and the mystics are the ones who really kind of brought the reincarnation part to the fore in our tradition.
Well, if we are reincarnated, I hope that we all, realize what's happening. So if I come back as like a new professional baseball player, I enjoy myself, in the next life. The Zohar says 3 names has the soul of man: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama. They are all combined with each other, yet their strength is found in 3 places. Nefesh remains in the grave until the body is decomposed and turned into dust, during which time it flits about in this world, seeking to mingle with the living and to learn of their troubles. And in the hour of need, it intercedes for them. Are there traditions that come from this idea?
I have no idea.
Again, in this mystical tradition, the soul was divided into 3 parts: Nefesh, Neshama, and Ruach. Nefesh was essentially what it was in the Bible, which is it was the life force. It's the thing that sustained and animated you as a human being. Neshama, which was the kind of more spiritual part, the part that had access to these spiritual mystical energies. And then Ruach, which was kind of an intellectual, ethical component of the self. The division of these 3 is not something that I'm terribly familiar with in terms of how they actually work, but I will comment on what it is that you said about the nefesh, the life force, sort of hanging around for a while. Part of what some rabbinic literature talks about is the length of time that the journey takes from this world to the next. In the Talmud, in Masechet Shabbat, in Tractate Shabbat, the rabbis talk about the fact that actually during Shiva, the neshama, the nefesh, is still hanging around, like kind of really present with everybody in a really immediate way. And then at some point over the next year, the neshama, the nefesh, returns to be with God. Why is that year significant? What do we do in the first year after death? We recite the Mourner's Kaddish. So what we are doing when we are saying the Mourner's Kaddish is praying, in essence, for this soul as it makes the journey from this world to the next. It's a fascinating idea. By the way, there are cultures around the world that believe that you need to hang on to the person who died for some time after they pass. There are even places in the world where that person actually is physically, the dead person is physically brought in to the home because they believe that the person may be, their body may be dead, but the soul is still there, and therefore, they're there to be, they need to be present in everybody else's life during that year, and then a year later, there's this, ceremony where the body is cremated or buried. So this is a pretty, familiar idea. And by the way, what's Halloween? Halloween is all like the day where the pagans believe that the soul sort of went up, the Day of the Dead, when the soul went up to its final destination. So all these things sort of happen to overlap with each other in terms of different religions and different cultures.
So I have another question. Do we believe in ghosts? And the reason I'm asking that question is, it seems to me that, Ghost Hunters, if you remember that series on television.
Still on.
Still on.
Yeah.
I don't think they talk about Jewish ghosts. It's only from, the other religions. And I think it's because we don't believe in ghosts, so we don't have any.
Yeah, I mean,
To go back to what you said before about this woman of Endor, the witch who brings back Samuel from the dead, right? That was an isolated incident, which Saul only did because he was completely off his rocker, right? And he was terrified that he was about to die and lose his kingship. That he was made an example of. Don't do this. So even if it's possible that there are Jewish ghosts, we are forbidden from bringing them into the world, right? That in the Torah, that's them, right? They are the ones, the other peoples, the other nations. They're the ones who do this kind of sorcery, mumbo jumbo, and we don't. That's not who we are, right? If we believe that there is some sort of an eternal spirit who's present, there's only one of those, right? And that's God.
I have a question that relates to this.
Okay. Here you go.
There are many people who believe in going to the grave of family members usually, but the Hasidim in New York go to the grave of the last rabbi whose name escapes me, Rabbi Schneerson, to petition him, his soul, for help or whatever, the same way that we always went to my grandparents' grave to honor them, to remember them, but that cemetery happens to be the same cemetery that Rabbi Schneerson is in, and before Rosh Hashanah there were crowds, and we were told they were petitioning him even after death. Can you address that?
Well, they obviously believed that there was somebody or something or a nefesh there that would hear them and could obviously intercede in whatever they wanted.
So it is a Jewish belief.
It's a Hasidic belief. So it's not, as you can see, if you want to call what we've been talking about a Jewish belief, it goes from A to Z, because there are all different ways of looking at what happens to us when we pass away.
Yeah, I will sort of tap into that, thinking about why it is that the Torah or some areas of Judaism might be wary of that kind of practice. We don't know where Moshe Rabbeinu is buried. We don't know where Moses is buried. Why? Because we were worried that if we knew where he was, we'd go to his grave and try and commune with him. And again, I say this not to disagree with what the Hasidim are doing at the Rebbe's grave. I'm just sort of pointing out why it is others may choose not to do that. And part of the discomfort with this conversation about the afterlife is the following. Judaism is not about death. It is not a religion that welcomes or invites death. It is a religion about life. And God saying to us in the Torah, don't go to Moses' grave, that's what God was saying. Live for the here and now, right? Moses is gone, he did his part, I give you a new leader, his name is Joshua. And that's what it is that we should be focusing on.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment that because we are not so preoccupied with what happens afterwards, we are preoccupied about making life worthwhile. They say that the rabbis who were really students hung their shroud above their desk to remind them that the end was always the same, but we make the most of what we do in our lives. And I think that's why we have such a social conscience, because we know we've got to do it while we're here.
Amen.
I have one more question, and then we'll open up to the audience. And this one I personally struggle with because it's hard for me to, in some cases, forgive. And so the question, and I'm going to say a name, and I want you to think about this. It's going to be tough to hear this, but you think about Hitler, okay? So what about the truly wicked? So we're saying that we're going to eventually be hugging him later on, in the afterlife because he's going to be forgiven?
Well, there are some traditions that say that he will, his soul, if you will be wandering for life, or that he will never be able to come back. And there was one more thing I was going to say about. Now, we know that Christians believe that if on his deathbed he embraced Christ as the Savior, he could go to heaven. He would go to heaven, which we.
Well, I do have to say
That also in Judaism there is a tradition that God gives you until the last minute of your life to repent. And if you repent, then God will forgive you, right? So, however, when we say that about someone like Hitler, it doesn't sound like it makes much sense, does it? I think it's a fair question. The part of what I want to say is there are very few Hitlers in the world. There are very few people who are pure, sort of concentrated evil in the world, and I think, at least I believe that anyway, right? And our tradition encourages us to think that way, to believe that people in this life, right, can be directed towards the good, and to be given every opportunity to do so. It's tempting. If you look at the Psalms, which are all about you're going to vanquish my enemies and they're going to die, right? My cup runs over because theirs doesn't. To think about this sort of us versus them mentality, and that for sure that exists also. That we want God to take revenge on our enemies. At the same time, I think the tradition has evolved. For me, at least, the tradition calls on me in different ways.
What about Jews who are excommunicated? Like Spinoza was excommunicated. What happens to that guy? Does he get a chance to, if he says, I want to come back,
right,
he can come back?
Yeah.
There are even places in the Jewish tradition where it talks about the righteous among the Gentiles, the righteous among the non-believers will get this place, right, in Olam Haba, along with everybody else. Do you have to serve? It's a legitimate read to look at the Talmud and say, look, this is only for members of the club, right? And if you're not a member of the club, if you don't believe in God, if you don't meet two mitzvot, if you don't fulfill these requirements in this life, sorry, right? That's it. You had your chance. It's over. And I also want to say that I have real discomfort with that idea.
But you said also that even when the neshama, if you will, or the souls, they still have a chance to repent.
They do, yes.
Even after they're gone.
Even after they're gone.
Thank you. Anybody have questions?
Yes. When my mother and father each died years apart, I understood for myself
that the body was just a thing, and that the soul went. They each were in a coma. I don't remember, I assume that a rabbi, one of our rabbis, did go in with him with a book in the hand. I wasn't in the room, and I'm assuming that that was what happened. Now, when my dear friend passed away, her daughter and son-in-law were Shomer Shabbos, extremely Orthodox. And they ensured that from the time that she was in her coma and then passed, that someone was with her
Shomer.
all the time. And I understand that the people with her were her relatives or whoever. But that you can hire people to be with.
Cover condition.
So please explain. What are they doing? Why are they doing that?
So the reason they're doing that is sort of tangential to this conversation, which is to say, and this is, I think, something you should ask for Rabbi Wolf when he's here in a few weeks. They're doing this for to fulfill a very specific mitzvah called Kavod HaMet, which is about honoring the person who has died. And those certainly aspects of the soul perhaps still being around in this liminal time, and even in the 7 days after for Shiva, that the essence of the person is still there, right, and appreciates the care that's being given to the body, even though the body is a vessel. It is a sacred vessel because it was created by God, crafted, designed by God to carry the soul, and we accord it respect as long as we have the opportunity to care for it. And to leave it alone at this time would be a sign of not respecting the body, right? Of not the opposite of kavod hamet, and that to kind of like discard it, leave it to the side without anybody paying attention to it is, in essence, you would be saying, well, there isn't the same value that we had before now that the person has died to their body and to their soul. So I mean, that's the mitzvah that's sort of in play here. Talking about the hiring of the shomer and all those other things, that's very common in Jewish communities, and that's a service that funeral homes often provide in coordination with synagogues, is that there's someone who sits with the body, and many times they're asked to read from Psalms. They're asked to pray for the person or on behalf of that person, again, as their soul is kind of in the vicinity and on that journey upwards.
So now I have a question about the mourner's Kaddish. You know that there are Jews who are upset if they can't say the Kaddish for a parent, and what I learned was, and I think you said it earlier, that by saying the Kaddish you are helping the neshama to get closer to God. And I was also told that you are supposed to say it for a year. But how many months do we actually say it? 11. Because the rabbi said, no one is as evil who deserves 365 days of saying the Kaddish. So there is some kind of mystical magic surrounding this statement about God's existence. You all know it says nothing to do about death.
Yeah, the danger of religious ideas in many cases is that when you tell people that you have the answer, and people choose not to follow that answer, that they are going to believe that what you're saying to them is you're wrong, or you're being disrespectful to the dead, or you're making a choice, right, that doesn't reflect God's will or doesn't reflect the tradition. So I don't know if this is where you were going, but sort of that fear about saying Kaddish, as if you don't say that, right, some calamity, some disaster is going to happen. I feel that there are lots of ways in which you can care for the soul of a person who has gone, and that I, as a rabbi, find real power and meaning in this particular way of doing it, and know people who have gotten a lot of meaning out of that experience. And by the way, most of them are not thinking about necessarily the soul of their departed loved one when they're saying the mourner's Kaddish. Not in that way anyway. They're thinking about the community that they formed as a result of saying mourner's Kaddish, or they're thinking about the memories of the person who has died. But it's not specifically a concern, a real concern that comes from deep conviction about the condition of the soul. They're doing it for a different reason. And I think as a rabbi in the 21st century, you have to be happy when someone's making a religious choice for any reason whatsoever, even if it's not the reason that you tell them is the right reason.
And if I may, what about? I remember as in traditional synagogues, if your parents are alive and you say the mourner's Kaddish, you're wishing them dead, right? And I was not allowed to go into the Yizkor service. I was raised conservadox, and I was not allowed to go into the Yizkor service. It was only for adults. And if
your parents were alive.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah, I think we're straying a little bit a far field, but when someone comes to me and says, "Rabbi, can I say the mourner's Kaddish?" the answer is always yes.
Yeah.
I can't ever deny somebody the opportunity to pay tribute to the dead. What I believe as a rabbi is that certain people have obligations, right? If you're a child, a sibling, a parent, God forbid, a spouse, Jewish tradition assigns you the obligation of being a mourner, and one of the responsibilities of a mourner is to say mourner's Kaddish. Notice I didn't say grandchild. Rabbi, can I say mourner's Kaddish for my grandfather? What am I going to say? No? I'm going to deny that person the opportunity to express their grief, their loss, or their gratitude for the fact that this person lived. I can't square that, right? That doesn't seem to be doing anything wrong. I'll get you next.
So I have there's a word we've used here, and the word is past. And for some reason, for me, it's like nails on a chalkboard. It euphemizes die, death, dead. And so I prefer those words, and I get cringy from that word past, but yet it's supposed to soften the feeling. So I do have a question on this, and that is in Hebrew or in ancient language, is there a euphemism for these words, nouns, verbs, past tense?
Good question. Can I just want to say something? Even though I'm in the funeral business, it's hard for us as well to say things to families. We don't know what to say, and you make a good point, because there's a lot of terminologies that we use that's supposed to sort of soften the blow, and we find it uncomfortable as well because we don't know what to say. The reality of it is nobody knows what to say because they're not in your shoes, right? It's about empathy. You can be so empathetic, but you really don't know how that person's feeling and what is soft to them as to someone else. So that's something I think for all of us to understand, because when we have someone that passes, a friend, family member, and you don't know what to say, it's okay, because they don't know what to say either. The people that work there really don't know what to say. We sort of kind of go through motions because we're just as lost for words of what to say when we see how grieving you are.
So it's a great question. First of all, the answer is yes. If you look at the back of the gravestones if you look at a gravestone in Hebrew, it will list the date of death and will not use the Hebrew verb mem vav taf, which means to die. It will use a different verb, pei tet resh, which means niftar, which sort of means to be released, right, in a sense. So even on the gravestone itself, there's this discomfort with the harshness and the starkness of death. On the other hand, you are right in sort of calling us out for dancing around the issue. Why do we shovel earth on the grave? Why do we participate in that action? Because it makes death real. There is nothing more terrifyingly real than the sound of that earth hitting that casket. It is one of the most awful sounds, and at the same time it has real spiritual power, because it, like the eulogy, which is designed to break the heart, it pulls grief out of you and gives it full expression. If you don't confront death, then you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing as a mourner. That's why we give you 7 days, 30 days, a year to express yourself, to give voice to your grief, to come to terms with your new reality. Otherwise, you're just hiding from something. And I will say that sort of connects to our conversation about the afterlife, which is part of my discomfort about the conversation about the afterlife is precisely this. Because it softens death in a certain way that might prevent us from dealing with the reality of the fact that we're still here and that we have to figure out a way with honesty to find some clarity about how to move forward. If we're imagining that this person exists in a real way in some place, not that that's not a valid idea or useful idea or a sacred idea or a Jewish idea, sometimes that has the power to take us away from our focus of actually dealing with their actual death.
And I want to add about the shoveling. It's the beginning of closure.
Yes.
We bury our dead as soon as it's possible. Jan's brother passed away in Israel, and his brother was already in the ground before they told his mother.
Wow.
So she couldn't even, there was no closure for her. But on the other hand, we don't put it off. We move forward as quickly as possible so that we, as the mourners, can move forward as quickly as possible.
Death's a destination, right?
How does Judaism feel about cremation?
You want to start?
Just open up a can of worms, that one.
Judaism says no. In fact, everybody thinks that Reform rabbis either encourage it or they say it's okay. I can tell you that Rabbi Paley tries to tell people who say, I want my father to be cremated, that it is not a Jewish custom. We don't believe in it. He doesn't stop them if that's what they want, but he tells them it's not a Jewish custom.
I mean, I have very little to add to that. I mean, I'm certainly in agreement with you, but also aware of the fact that cremation has become increasingly a choice that's made in Jewish communities, and that those who choose to cremate their loved ones should be receiving the same amount of attention and care from their synagogues and their communities than those who make the choice to bury or whose loved ones have made the choice to bury. So it is certainly right. I share that same conviction. The other thing that I'll just sort of throw in here really quickly is that when you talk to people about the resistance that Jews have to cremation, this of course heightened in the aftermath of the Shoah, the Holocaust. That this was something that was done to us, right, and that we have that kind of visceral reaction to it. And it also goes back religiously to the Torah, that we come from the dust and we are returned to the dust, and we must be returned to the dust in the original form in which we were given. Naturally. Yeah.
And also, the other thing is, especially people who want their ashes sprinkled over the sea or over a field, there's no place to go.
Yep.
There's no place to, like a graveside. Now, I know of people who are in urns, and the urn is actually buried in the ground, and there is, right. But for sprinkling the remains over a place, if you will, there's maybe if it's, this was my mother's favorite tree, and she's there, you go to the tree, I guess.
Zane, are you seeing more of that in your business?
Yes, so let me just preface this with, when I took over ownership of Dallas Jewish Funerals, one of my biggest, you know what, maybe it's, one of my main goals was to treat the clergy as sort of my board of directors. So I sort of wiped the slate clean with the organization, started fresh, and the first thing I did was I met with just about every rabbi in the Metroplex. Avi was you guys passed me on to Avi, but no, Avi's a great guy, Avi, he's a friend of mine. So I met with them, and this conversation came up. I met with them on a number of things as far as how the best to run the business and Kavod Hamed and how to make sure that the rituals were followed properly. Cremation was a big hot button. And I want to back what Cantor Croll said, was there wasn't a single rabbi that said, yeah, go ahead, cremate, no problem, no big issue. Every single one of them said, please have them come and speak to me before. So what we do as a best practice, when we have families that talk to us about pre-planning, which is becoming more and more common, we ask them to talk to the rabbi or a rabbi and get a perspective before we move forward. Because all the rabbis are in agreement that they're going to talk to you about not cremating. So.
Can an urn be buried in a Jewish cemetery if somebody's been cremated?
So, and to your point, Stuart, a lot of these questions are very sensitive, and so when we get put in a rock, and we as a funeral home, we get put between a rock and a hard place. And I will tell you that I always defer to my board of directors, which is right here.
No. So in a Jewish,
what was the question?
The question was, can a urn be interred in a Jewish cemetery? Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for every Jewish cemetery everywhere, but certainly at Sheraton Memorial Park and in our section at Sparkman Hillcrest, no. Rabbis will officiate in a memorial service in advance of the cremation or after the cremation, but will not participate in an interment ceremony precisely for that reason. And you have some hands over here, so really.
Yeah, and I can answer some more questions for you on the side if you have some questions.
There was a question. They had something.
You sure? Go ahead.
Slightly tangential, but you mentioned Jewish excommunication. I always thought of that as a Christian concept. Who is it that can excommunicate Jews?
Priest.
Rabbis excommunicated each other in the Talmud, right?
Right. Put them in town.
Right. It is not something that you will find practiced with any regularity in the Jewish world today. So don't worry about it. Nobody.
So we have to wrap up in about 5 minutes. So I'm going to open up to 2 more questions, starting with this lovely young lady over here.
I find it very interesting that with all of this discussion, you've never mentioned the person who commits suicide.
Person who commits suicide. Well, that's kind of, we're talking about the afterlife.
That might be a Rabbi Wook question.
Well, you're asking if a person who commits suicide has an afterlife, or what the?
All of the above. What happens to that person? What happens to that person's soul? Does that person come back?
Yeah.
What do you do?
I don't have an answer for you in terms of the specifics of what the sources say about that person. I'm curious as to whether there's actually much at all said about a person who commits suicide in terms of the condition of their soul. I will say that will say this, which is that I think that most rabbis have come to understand that suicide is an effect of mental illness, and that mental illness is, akin to a kind of physical illness, which is to say that we are no longer really kind of segregating in any way in terms of the way that we treat people, who treat families, and what it is that they are encouraged to do and participate in. So I would have, for that reason, right, I would have a hard time saying that there is a distinction between what happens to the soul of a person who commits suicide versus the person who may die.
So what about the ritual?
Well-
Let's just assume that somebody commits suicide. Is the ritual the same as if they hadn't?
For us, it is, yes.
When I was a kid, my father's cousin committed suicide, and my mother broke down in tears. And I said, why? And she said, because Celia can't be buried in the Jewish cemetery. But as you said, times have changed. And rabbis and cantors have come to realize that suicide comes from mental illness.
And actually, the diagnostic statistic manual that all social workers and psychologists use, several years ago, suicide was added into that manual as a mental illness, as a result of a mental illness. And I think that's, from my understanding, that triggered a lot of these changes in thought process with suicide. We're going to treat someone that committed suicide the same as we're going to treat anybody else, and make sure they have the proper Jewish burial. One more question?
We'll go one more after that. We can do one more.
I'll be around afterwards.
Those pleading eyes, I'll come back.
Could you address end-of-life issues? All the doctor says, do you have a, what do you call it?
Living will.
Directive.
So Rabbi Wolk, we will be having another discussion like this in the coming weeks, led by Rabbi Wolk. He's phenomenal on these discussions. He actually does a whole talk, and I believe we're going to be implementing this ethical wills, and we'll discuss a lot of topics around wills and agents of final disposition and things of that nature. So please come back to that. We'll do one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Deborah.
To bring up something to completion, what's the Jewish attitude or tradition originally and now with mausoleum burial rather than in the ground burial?
So mausoleums are generally permitted, even in conservative circles. If you look at the Torah, what you'll see is that bodies were placed in some sort of burial cave, and that the natural process of decomposition occurred, and then the bones were gathered in some sort of ossuary together with the other family bones. So that's why above ground burial is generally permitted.
Although my parents had prearranged to be buried, their bodies would be in a mausoleum, and we sat down with the funeral director, and he said, well, now you know it's $150 for your husband. What's the liquid that they put in you?
Embalming fluid.
Right, embalming fluid. My mother broke down and cried and said, we don't believe in that. We don't believe in that. So fortunately I said, okay, what would it cost us to just get a regular in-ground grave? But in Florida, at the very least, any body that's in a mausoleum has to be embalmed.
I'll add to that. So you're not going to find most of the cemeteries around here are corporate owned, okay? They are going to require you to be embalmed if you're going to be put in a mausoleum. And there's a number of reasons why. I can explain to you probably off microphone, because it's not necessarily pleasant.
Not a pleasant subject.
So that's the reality of it. Now, I do know that there are Jewish cemeteries out there that have mausoleums. So we would have to talk to them about their requirements, but generally speaking, a corporate-owned cemetery like a Sparkman Hillcrest, a Restland, they require embalming to be put in the mausoleum. So then we get into we get back to whether it's okay as far as a Jewish custom, then that, I would say the answer becomes no, because embalming is not part of the Jewish ritual. Do you agree with that?
I would agree, and at the same time, I think for me, there's a big distinction between someone choosing to be embalmed or someone choosing to be buried in a suit as opposed to in the burial shrouds than some of the other sort of larger issues. So I think there's room to be lenient in those situations.
Yeah. Deborah?
We want to thank our panelists, Cantor, Croll, and Rabbi Roffman. Thank you so much. And we'd like to thank Zane and his staff with Dallas Jewish Funerals. We hope you, I don't know if enjoy is the right word. We hope you found this interesting and that you perhaps learned something that you didn't know. If you have other questions, they can certainly be addressed individually. And we do want to let you know that Dallas Jewish Funerals has brought a, what did you call it?
These are
a resource.
It's a resource guide. These are very informational books that walk through all of the Jewish traditions and customs around burial. It also discusses the weeks and months after burial. So a lot of the questions you've asked, a lot of the terminology is in this book. It also allows you to sort of start documenting. One of the biggest things that we encourage families, whether it's with me or with one of the other guys, we encourage you to sit down with us at some point and talk through this and start putting some plans in place. Because it is better for your family in the long run, but this is a starting point. You can each have one. I'm not, no obligation. We're not going to psycho email you or anything. Promise. Just that's my one plug.
That's our job.
That's my one plug that Deborah gives me. Except we are the only Jewish funeral home in Dallas. Just as a plug.
So please feel free to take one of those, and we hope that you'll join us again for another one of the programs in this series, or join us for some of our other events like our Jim Schwartz annual lecture series or our historical Jewish Dallas bus tour. There are a lot of things that we do. We are a membership organization, so if you like what you hear, we'd love to have you join us and help keep us going. And thank you all very much for coming. We're thrilled to have had such a
definitely come back to Rabbi Wolf. You will all definitely benefit. Would you like one of these?